Welcome back to the shop, friends. Buddy here at House of Props, and in today's build video I'm finishing up on a project I began back in the spring, but some life things got in the way. Well, I was finally able to finish this Viking helmet that features an attached deer skull. Both the helmet and the skull are made completely out of EVA foam, and I'm going to try to include the building of both the helmet and the skull as well as the painting in this one video. The link to the templates is in the description if you want to build one along with me, so let's head to the shop and get started. I'm going to start by building the helmet first, so I'm starting with part A. This piece has two seams in it, and those need to be sealed up first. To do that, I'm applying an even layer of contact cement to both edges with a scrap brush. Instead of waiting for the contact cement to dry, I like to speed up the process with a heat gun. I'm only drying to the point where the cement doesn't look wet anymore. Then the edges can be pressed together. And the same thing can be done to the other seam as well. Next up is part B. The seams are closed in each piece, and then each part B is attached to the sides of A. Now when attaching, you want to stretch part A as you go. This stretching is what helps give the dome of the helmet its curve. I'm also trying to keep the outer edge surface as flat and even as possible in order to avoid cleanup headaches later on. Part C gets a groove carved into the back along the center line like so. This will fold onto itself, so I'm going to apply contact cement and dry it like before. While I get the groove ready, I would really appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button if you haven't already. It's completely free to you and will help my channel grow. Plus, if you click the notification bell, you can customize your notifications so you never miss a project. Thank you. And with the cement at the correct dry point, part C can now bend on the groove like so. Then it can be attached to the dome. This groove marks the center line on part C, and this can be aligned to the seam in part A. Part C attaches to the bottom edge, and again, I'm trying to keep the surface as even as possible. Part D gets attached to the rear of the helmet in the same manner. I'm currently using the heat gun to warm the foam because I want to shape the bottom so it flares out at the back. By warming the foam, shaping it, and holding it in place, the foam will retain its shape after it's cooled back down. You can see how the bottom lip has retained the curve. Part E is cut from 2mm foam and can be glued onto part C. The eye openings align, and I found it easier to attach by lining up the point with the center line of part C. Part F is glued so it wraps around the entire circumference of the helmet. It sits so it covers the seam between the dome and the bottom half. If there is any excess, just trim it away. I've purposely made my seam align to the front because it'll be hidden once the skull is attached. Part G sits on the center line of the helmet and wraps up and over the dome to touch part F in the back. Again, any excess can be trimmed. Then the two part H's are attached perpendicular to part G, dividing the dome into 4 quadrants. Part G and part H help even out the dome shape and allow the helmet to not look too angular. Next, I take a 120 grit drum on my Dremel and texture parts F, G, and H. I want a random pattern, so I'm lightly touching the surface and varying the pressure and the direction of the drum. This will create this hammered texture look. Next, I switch to this polishing ball tip, and I'm going to use this to add texture to the inside of the 4 quadrants. I'm lifting and lowering the tip repeatedly, and it creates a different hammered metal texture. This helmet will not have a variety in color when painted, so I'm relying on the textures to create the variation. To give the bottom some visual depth and detail, I cut some thin strips of 2mm foam and glue these around the edges and the eye openings like so. Next, I'm using this cone smoothing tip on the Dremel, and I'm just hitting the strip's edges to lightly round them over, so they don't look so cut with a knife. The Celtic deer details are cut from 2mm foam and get glued onto part D. I've centered mine off of the helmet center line, and I've used a ballpoint pen to give myself registration lines so that when I'm gluing them down, I can focus solely on the gluing and not have to worry about placement. Then I do the same thing like I did with the strips by lightly rounding over the edges. To make the deer look like they're embossed, I'm going to use this tip on my wood burner. This technique works great to get fine details on pieces, especially when they need to read like they're stamped or embossed metal. But when you do this, you are basically melting the foam, which means the fumes are toxic, so make sure you work in a well-ventilated room and take all the necessary precautions. Next, I switched to the sanding tip on the Dremel, and now I'm going to add texture to the bottom part of the helmet. I'm using the same technique like on the dome, but I'm only texturing the 6mm and not the 2mm. The reason I'm doing this after I've attached the details is simply because I wanted the details to sit flat, and they wouldn't if I texture the surface first. At this point, the helmet is pretty much complete, so I go ahead and heat seal the foam. This will shrink the pores in the foam and allow it to better receive paint and primer. And to heat seal, I have the gun set to medium and I waft it back and forth over the surface. Once it's cool, I'm going to take this quick seal and seal up the visible seams on the dome. I simply smear it on with a putty knife and then dip my finger in water and blend the quick seal to even off the edges. Depending on your seams, you may find you have to add more than one layer, which is fine. You'll just need to wait for the first to dry. Once the quick seal is dry, the helmet can be sprayed with Plasti-Dip. This will seal the foam even more and give a flexible paintable surface. At this point, I'm going to jump to building the skull. I begin with the skull part A and seal up these edges. After prepared with the contact cement and the heat gun, the edges meet each other and this starts to create the back of the skull. The same process can be used to seal up these small little seams as well. With the seams closed, I want to shape the piece slightly, so I'm just bending and rolling it to give it a slight curve. Originally I had a seam in part B, but I ended up removing it in the final pattern because it really didn't help. Part B is rolled and bent just like part A, and part B attaches to part A right here at these V and pointed ends. Part C attaches to part B on the sides like so. Part D, which creates the eye sockets, attaches into the curves between A and B. This can be a little tricky since only the edges are touching, but take your time and you'll be fine. Then part D attaches to itself at the double lines. The seams are closed on part B, which is then attached to the nose area of the skull. Notice how I'm attaching E to the top of part B and keeping the outer edge as even as possible. The registration lines are important here in order to get E to curve correctly and hold part B in the correct position. Part F gets attached to the inside edges of part C and B, like so. Again, these registration lines are important and you want to make sure these pieces are securely attached to each side because they get attached to each other along the center line, and this is what pulls the skull into the correct shape. So make sure the edges are covered with an even layer of contact cement. The back ends of F curve up and attach to these short ends on the part C's. For the part G's, I begin by aligning to the 3 registration lines on part A. Then this side bends around to connect to part A as well. Yes, there is a small triangular opening. This will get filled in later on. Then part G wraps under so that this edge sticks behind the tab on part D, and this edge on part G wraps to the inside of the eye socket and follows the bottom edge of the opening. This tab that sticks off of D will be used later. Now, there will be a triangular opening on the back of the skull when it's finished, but before I attach the other part G, I want to attach 2 part H's to the inside of each eye socket. One is already glued in place so that this curve follows the opening of the socket, and the second gets the same curve to attach to the bottom edge of the first piece. The same is done to the second part G, which is then attached to the skull. Here is the triangular opening I was talking about. This is going to be necessary to attach the antlers, but in the end, you can close it up if you want to. Part I will become the teeth. Each eye can be attached to the bottom of the skull in alignment with these registration lines on part C. Next, I took 2 scraps of 10mm foam and glued them onto the tabs on each part D and into the triangular openings in the part Gs. These don't need to be any specific shape, which is why scraps worked perfectly. I switched the tip of my wood burner to this one and create 2 openings in the top of part E. Next up, I started work on the antlers. It's pretty much the same process of attaching the foam. I'm using 2mm foam and aligning the edges on the pieces so each number aligns with itself. I started with 1 and will work my way from there. It can be a little fiddly when working with such small, thin edges, but the results are going to be so worth it and look so much better than simply making wire antlers covered with foam. When sealing up the points, I found it easier to have the inside of the edges touch first and then fold the top over and squeeze and pinch the seam shut. Following the numbers is pretty self-explanatory. The only part that is a little tricky is this area where the edges 14 and 15 align with their corresponding edges, but then 14 and 15 align with each other at the end of this point like so. So this is what an assembled antler looks like, and the antlers will sit in these openings in the skull. But first I want to fill in the antlers to make them more solid, but I want them to remain light. I begin by filling in the points with small pieces of 4mm foam. These are excess rivets I've had in the shop, and they work perfectly. To fill in the larger areas of the antlers, I'm using 6mm foam scraps. I tap the antler as I fill periodically to make sure that the filler has settled nicely and there aren't any gaps. Once filled, I seal the base with a scrap piece of 2mm and then trim away the excess. To the base, I then glue a scrap piece like so. This will insert into the skull opening and give something to hold the antler to the skull. I glue the strip to the inside of the skull using the triangular opening on the bottom. At this point, I switch to the smoothing stone on my Dremel and clean up the seams on the skull and the antlers. This tip doesn't remove a lot of material quickly, which makes it great for cleaning up subtle unevenness along seam lines. Once sanded, I heat seal the skull and the antlers and proceed to fill in the seams with the quick seal just like I did on the helmet. On the antlers, I apply it over the entire surface and blend and smooth it with my finger. This will give a more realistic texture to the antlers, and it can be lightly sanded when it's dry to remove any remaining fingerprints or if any areas just got a little too thick. Those scrap 10mm foam pieces have been sanded with the 120 grit drum to round them over, and now I'm going to apply foam clay to blend where they meet the skull. I'm also using the foam clay to build up texture on the antler base. I start by adding a ring around the nub like this, and then dip my finger in water to blend it onto the foam surface. I'm also going to be adding some where the antlers meet the skull, just to fill in the little gap. Deer antlers have some ridges and bumps up the root base of the antler, so I'm adding some small lines of the foam clay and will blend these into uneven ridges and bumps. As I mentioned, I added clay to blend these areas of the scraps, and I also ended up adding some clay to the inside edges of the eye sockets, just to even it out and give some nice texture. So now I'm going to let it sit and dry overnight. Once the clay is dry, I want to sculpt some detail with my Dremel. Using a small drum, I carve the tooth texture onto each part A. As you can see, I drew some reference lines with a pen just to help guide me along, and I'm using the edge of the drum to carve in the texture, not the full drum. I also carved some unevenness to this nose area, and again I've drawn in some reference lines so I can get some bone texture into the surface of the skull. Next, I switch back to this tip on my wood burner. This tool works great to create all the suture lines in the skull, and by using a combination of the Dremel and the wood burner, you can achieve highly accurate details and textures. Once all the carving and lining is finished, the skull is looking like this. Where new foam has been exposed from the Dremel detailing, I'm hitting those areas again with the heat gun to seal them. Then I will base the skull with the Plasti Dip. I'm spraying a pretty thick layer, and I'll wait 30 minutes and then give it a second coat, and after the second coat, I'll let the Plasti Dip cure overnight. The next day, I base the skull and the antlers with a khaki tan mixture from white and burnt umber. I'm making sure the paint gets into all the texture details. After the tan has dried, I then pounce a white onto the skull and antlers. Some of the tan showing through is great, and by pouncing it, it leaves behind this wonderful texture in the paint that will help the surface look more like bone. When the white is dry, the skull is looking like bleached bone, which depending on the project might be great, but I want mine to look more natural and uncured, which real bones have this natural yellow coloring to them, and real antlers as well have a darker hue with dark brown accents in the bumpy texture. To achieve the correct color, I make a thin raw sienna wash and brush this onto the surface, and then dab the paint to lighten and blend it. After the raw sienna has dried, I brush the antlers with a burnt sienna wash and then dab again. This will remove a lot of the sienna and leave behind a subtle layering of color. Then when the burnt sienna is dry, I repeat the process with a burnt umber wash. This time I'm only applying the wash to the bumpy texture on the roots of the antlers, and when dabbed, it'll remain in the recessed areas. I use the same wash on the texturing on the skull. By applying and wiping, the paint will remain in the texture and leave some variation in the raw sienna wash as well. After the washes have dried, I want to pull out some highlight areas, so I make a white wash and apply it to the larger flat areas as well as the antler tips. Adding just this one little step makes the finish look more real and natural. Okay, back to the helmet. When last we left the helmet, it got sprayed with the Plasti Dip. I'm now base painting it with a charcoal gray. I found this to be a great base color when painting steel. Next up, I'm dry brushing a metallic tin over the surface, mainly trying to catch the high spots of the texture and leaving some of the gray to show through. And once coated, the helmet is looking like this. To tone down the brightness, I'm applying a black wash across the surface and then dab a lot of it away. This makes the color look more like steel and less like silver. Once the black is dry, I take the burnt umber wash and apply it to areas where dirt and grime would naturally occur, so places like creases, seams, and corners. Once all the paint is dry, I prepare to glue the skull to the helmet. I'm going to use the triangular opening on the rear of the skull to sit on part F of the helmet. Exact placement is up to you, but I want the skull to sit in the upper forehead area so it doesn't affect vision out of the helmet. And I'm just going to use CA glue to glue it in place. Next, I'm using part J from the helmet pattern and hitting them with the heat gun to seal the foam before attaching. I want the pieces to attach to the skull and the helmet so it looks like they are bands of metal holding the two together. I've glued the straps in place and have placed 4 rivets onto each strap. And while I was at it, I just decided to add some rivets around the metal strapping on the helmet as well, just to add a little bit more detail. The straps and the rivets were painted to match the rest of the metal helmet, and I'm now taking a little of the raw sienna and applying some small thin areas to add a little rust to the strapping. I felt the helmet was feeling a little dark with the bright skull attached to the top, so I dry brushed a tiny bit of the metallic tin on its textured surface just to give it a little pop. As the final paint step, I wanted to add a little bit more aging to the skull to make it look like it has been exposed to the elements, and the best way to do that is to add some green. Since skulls are organic material, it is very common for them to gather mold and moss when exposed to damp conditions, and by giving the skull a subtle green effect in spots, added to the depth and realism in the paint. And with that, the Viking deer helm is finished. I have to say, personally, I'm thrilled with the final results. I showed some pics to some friends, and they couldn't believe when I told them that it was EVA foam. I literally had to show them clips of the building process to prove it wasn't 3D printed. All the textures in the bone and antlers and are juxtaposed by the textures in the helmet. It feels like it should be too much, but they work together perfectly. If you enjoyed this project, please click on the like button and let me know in the comments what you thought. Again, if you want to make your own, a link to the template can be found in the description, and feel free to share this video with all your friends and family. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at House of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.